Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and start. Sure, people will be coming in as well as we start. Let me see if I can get this up. All right, can you all see the screen?
Yes.
Right. Okay. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Adriana Bankston. I'm the CEO and managing publisher for the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. And I want to welcome you all here today for our science policy paper writing workshop on open science. So first, I want to provide a brief background on the journal for those of you that may not be familiar. Just a little bit to tell you a little bit about what we're doing. And so we're going to put our website in the chat. And so JSPG is an internationally recognized and open access peer-reviewed publication. We cover every corner of science and technology policy. And through the journal, we also bolster research and writing credentials for early career researchers in science policy and encourage them to engage in science policy discourse and debate. We publish policy work in a variety of formats, including op-eds, technology assessments, memos, briefs, analyses, white papers, book reviews, workshop proceedings, and other research articles. We also promote the publications through our global mailing lists and events such as workshops, webinars, and a podcast where we interview authors. And you can follow JSPG on all the social media channels, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, LinkedIn. Again, we'll put our accounts in the chat. If you can follow us. We also have a newsletter where you can keep up to date with all of our future issues and events. So again, here's just a little more background on the different formats and topics that we publish on. Again, you can find this information on our website, sciencepolicyjournal.org. So for some background on today's event, as you've seen, JSPG, UNESCO, and MGCY have launched a call for papers and competition on open science policies as an accelerator of the Sustainable Development Goals. And the submission deadline is July 10th, and the issue is supported in kind also by outreach partners from the Global Young Academy Working Group on Open Science that we'll hear from today. So again, we'll share the links in the chat to the call for papers. Again, that's where a lot of useful background can be found in terms of some of the information on open science, and we'll cover some of that today as well. So a little bit of just basics around the special issue. So some of the background is focus on looking to find a more accessible, transparent, and more participatory way of designing, conducting, publishing, and evaluating scholarly research. And we want to bridge the science, technology, and innovation gaps between and within countries, fulfilling the human right to science and leaving no one behind. And the topics, again, if you go to the website or to this bit.ly link, you'll see the topics that we'll be covering in the special issue and also today revolve around guiding questions, which are on the website, but also just we'll touch briefly on some of these today to help you think through what we mean by open science, what the different aspects are. And so here are just a few, again, a list of what these different areas are: capacity building and sustainable infrastructures, public participation, collaborative governance, citizen science and decision-making, cultural development and evaluation, linking science to policy, science for all, and standard setting for knowledge creation. Again, these are all on the website as well and are based on the UNESCO recommendations. So now, 1 second. Okay, there we go. So today's event, the writing workshop, is the first in a series leading up to the submission deadline. And so today we'll talk about how to write science policy papers on open science. And you can see that we'll have 4 webinars following this, 2 in April and May, June, and then again, the deadline is in July. So Again, we'll share the link to our events in the chat, JSPG Open Science events. You can register for all these events now, and you can also see online on the page what the different events are about. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the first webinar, which is on April 8th. So this will be sort of the setting the stage for open science policy so we can have these conversations. And it will be moderated by Paola Kier-Massouz, who is works in capacity building, and she's data scientist for TP Vision and also for IDOR. And the panelists, as you can see here, Ellen Pake, who is a policy analyst at OECD, Joanna McIntyre, who is associate director for AMBL ABI services, and Masha Chema, who is a policy advisor for the Office of Science Advisor in Canada. So looking forward to this next week. Again, you can register for this event now. So with that, I'm gonna stop sharing now and introduce our first speaker, to tell you a little bit about the UNESCO recommendations. So Fereshteh Rafieian, she is an associate program specialist in the section for Science, Technology, and Innovation Policy in the Natural Sciences sector of UNESCO. Since 2019, when she joined UNESCO, she has been involved in the development of the UNESCO recommendation on open science, which again, this call for papers is based on, and now works in the implementation. She got her PhD in biophysics from TU Dresden and Max Planck Institute, molecular cell biology and genetics in Germany. So go ahead and share your screen.
Thank you, Adriana, for the nice introduction, and thanks for this great initiative that you and your colleagues in JSPG have started, and thanks for involving UNESCO, of course. I think it's a very timely action. Yeah, I think the fact that brings every one of us together today is that we all agree on the importance of science for sustainable development, our societies, and the importance of that for peace. And in this, we don't want to leave anyone behind, so we agree that access to science and benefits of that to everyone is important. And this is also the vision of UNESCO, and that's why UNESCO is committed to promoting open science around the world. And in the last 2 years, also we were reminded again, we were reminded again by COVID-19 pandemics about the importance of timely and free access to scientific data, publications, informations, and methods. We learned how important it is to have scientific collaboration and sharing of data or information at different levels. And we learned that it's important to promote the dialogue between scientists, policymakers, and the society. And in a world that's still like 70% of all the scientific publications is still behind some kind of paywalls, and knowing that these scientific publications are mainly funded by public money, it's a bit painful. Still, scientists could reverse the numbers, and at least in the field of COVID, now more than 85% of the scientific publications are open access, and this is showing us that open science is possible. But open science is possible not just because we are thinking about that now, it's possible because for the last decade, scientists have realized the opportunities and also challenges of the digital era, and they have started this movement, and the movement has grown in different parts of the world and in different disciplines. But while the movement is evolving in different regions, member states of UNESCO and scientists and all the stakeholders of science have realized that at this moment, because especially we need to do international collaborations for fulfilling open science, all the stakeholders have realized that we need an international policy framework for open science, a framework that provides a common definition of open science. It provides shared values and guiding principles for that. And it provides a set of actions for countries to promote open science. And that is why in 2019, UNESCO member states decided that the organization will lead the development of an international standard setting instrument in the form of a UNESCO recommendation. UNESCO recommendations are legal instruments on any special issue that set some norms, international norms and principles, and invite the countries to take any step, legislative, technical, investment, to promote these principles, of course, in agreement with their constitutions. And so UNESCO in the last 2-3 years was in charge of this. And of course, to reach a global consensus on anything, you need to involve and identify all stakeholders and actors of that issue. And you need to include their point of view. And when you open science, you are extending the stakeholders of science beyond the traditional scientific community. You involve the citizens, you involve publishers, researchers, students, academia, indigenous people, founders of science. And that is why UNESCO developed the recommendation through a very inclusive, transparent, and consultative process. We collected input from different stakeholders through different ways of consultation, from an online consultation to different regional meetings or thematic consultations with young scientists, indigenous people, IP experts. And we also received inputs from different groups of stakeholders, for example, the citizen science community, open data organizations, libraries, open access platforms. And then based on these inputs that we received, an open science advisory committee, an international open science advisory committee developed the drafts of the recommendation. And we are lucky to have one of the members of this committee with us today, Vincent. And thank you for joining us. So the first draft of the recommendation was developed and it was submitted to member states for them to be able to give some comments on it. So comments and partners of UNESCO had the chance to give comments. And based on their comments, the first draft was revised, and then an intergovernmental committee of legal and technical experts last May discussed the draft, and they negotiated and finalized the draft to be submitted to the General Conference of UNESCO. And last November, all the member states of UNESCO agreed that they want to adopt this and they want to report on their progress every 4 years. So this recommendation is now the first international normative instrument on open science. It contains the first internationally agreed definition of open science. It has common core values and guiding principles of open science. It addresses several or all actors and stakeholders of science, and it promotes actions in different levels. It also proposes innovative approaches for open science at different stages. And of course, for observing the development or progress of implementing the recommendation, UNESCO is working on a comprehensive monitoring framework for the recommendation. So coming to the content of the recommendation, as I said, so countries and stakeholders could agree on an inclusive definition of open science, which goes beyond only open access, which many of us think when we talk about open science, because science is not just about publishing papers, and it's not just about publishing the final result of a long scientific process. So the definition of open science in the recommendation includes 4 pillars. The first one, open scientific knowledge, includes scientific publications, open research data, open educational resources, open source software and codes, and open hardwares. Another pillar is open science infrastructures that scientists need to do science in an open way, and it could be virtual or physical infrastructures. The definition also promotes the engagement of social actors in open science. And this could be through, for example, crowdfunding, crowdsourcing, citizen science, or scientific volunteering. The recommendation also respects different scientific systems, and it promotes a dialogue between the conventional science system and these systems. For example, the indigenous knowledge holders, or marginalized scholars, or local communities. The recommendation, or based on this recommendation, values of open science are quality and integrity. So open science does not compromise the quality of science. Open science is a collective benefit. It's for all humanity as a whole, and it's based on equity and fairness. So it's about ensuring that everyone, independent from their region, their gender, their language, they all have equal access to science, and sharing of information is in a reciprocal and fair way. It also respects diversity of knowledge systems, languages, and inclusiveness. Guiding principles of open science defined in this recommendation are transparency, scrutiny, critique, and reproducibility of science, which leads to a higher quality of science. It's about equality of opportunities for all researchers and users of science. It's about responsibility and respect and accountability of scientists. When you open science, you are more responsible. And also then the society trusts science more. It's about collaboration, participation, and inclusion. It's about flexibility. When you are talking about a multi-stakeholder issue, you should consider that there is no one size fits all way to open science. You need to respect diversity and be flexible. And it's about sustainability in regard to like being long-term. So yeah, and the recommendation also recommends 7 areas of action to different member states to promote open science, from promoting a common understanding of science, open science, its challenges, its opportunities, and diverse paths to that. It promotes developing and enabling policy environments in each country. It promotes investing in human resource, training scientists, training those who provide service for researchers. And it's also promoting investing in infrastructures for open science. It promotes fostering a culture of open science by providing the right incentives for scientists to practice open science. And it also promotes innovative approaches to open science. And of course, it promotes cooperation and international collaboration for science. And the role of UNESCO for implementation of this recommendation, now that it's adopted, is to exchange and access to information through UNESCO science, through different UNESCO science and open solution programs. UNESCO tries to provide a forum for exchange of ideas and lessons learned in implementation of open science. It supports open science policy development in different regions and countries. It supports capacity building for different actors of open science. It works on a monitoring platform for open science. And it's also mobilizing different partners to work together at different levels, individual, institutional, national, and regional and international. And it's also building coalitions and partnership for advancement of science. And of course, everyone can join UNESCO for implementation of science. At this moment, we have the call for papers, which is, I think, is a great idea for scientists to identify issues of open science and provide policy solutions for that. And if you're also aware of some very good practices of open science, at this moment, we are collecting them to be able to share them with those who are interested, and this will be some tool for everyone to learn from each other. So please check the webpage, check the documents, reports about the process, and I'm happy to be with you today. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that great introduction. Hopefully it provided some context for the participants today. And again, we have a link to the recommendations from our page as well. So make sure to look at that, and we'll share the recording as well. All right, so now we'll move on. I want to also give the opportunity to some other partners to speak today and tell you a little bit about what they're doing and how we're working with them. So we're going to start with Natasha Gownaris, who is an assistant professor at Gettysburg College, and she leads the Global Young Academy's Open Science Working Group. In relation to today's event, she is passionate about open science as a tool for promoting inclusivity, accessibility, and collaboration in STEM, as well as open educational resources. And she obtained her PhD in marine science from Stony Brook. So she'll tell us a little bit about the working group and a paper on open science that she co-authored that we'll share in the chat as well.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Adriana, and to all of the other speakers. I'm just as much a learner as the people in this room. So I, as mentioned by Adriana, I'm a member of the Global Young Academy. I definitely recommend, as young scientists, you check that out. So we're, every year we have a call for members. We usually accept about 40 people each year, and you stay a member for 5 years. But there are a lot of different passions you can explore here, and one of the working groups focuses specifically on open science. So again, this is a really diverse group of young researchers and those who are scientists, but also really interested in bettering society through science. So the Open Science Working Group really works on pulling together young researchers' voices in influencing open science policy. So we did put in some comments for the UNESCO recommendations. And we also have a collaboration with the National Young Academies, which are present in many countries, to have a global science open working group. So we have both the Open Science Working Group within GYA, but if you're a member of one of the National Young Academies, you could also become part of the Global Open Science Working Group. Move forward. And one of the things I wanted to talk a little bit about today, and this is going to kind of repeat some of the stuff about this scientific life cycle, is that open science is not just about publication, it's about the entire process. And in fact, some of the things that occur earlier in the open science life cycle, like pre-registering your scientific reports or thinking about your data being or analysis being reproducible as you're doing it, winds up influencing how reusable and open the end products actually are. This is a paper that I worked on with 8 different members of GYA and NYAs that we just recently published, and I can put that in the chat in a second. And it looked at the barriers to participation in open science for early career researchers across each of these stages, not only barriers, but also knowledge of. And so I want to go into this knowing that the people who took the survey that I'm going to show you the data for are actually fairly educated on open science, and that they're part of a working group on open science, have clearly gone out of their way to be interested in this topic. So, the lack of knowledge of some of these different parts of open science is quite surprising. But one of the things you will see here is that in terms of barriers, the things that come up a lot are lack of time, lack of incentives. And I think the biggest one across any category of open science is lack of awareness and training. So if we move forward, you can see if we're looking at these two, that later stages of open science, in particular open publishing and open review and things like that are those that the scientists are more familiar with. So these here are scores of awareness on a Likert scale, where 1 means that there's no awareness of that facet of open science, and 5 means that the person is an expert on that facet of open science. And again, all 32 of the participants in this survey were people who were involved in working groups on open science. And you can see at these earlier stages in pre-registration, open processes and notebooks, open hardware, there's a big lack of awareness. One of the problems here again is that this creates these path dependencies where the open science later in the life cycle is also impacted by this lack of awareness at the beginning. And if you can move forward. And this is just in terms of the number of participants that actually participated in these different aspects of open science. So again, these are people who were part of working group in open science, and the participants were from something like 16 different countries in the case of this survey. And you can see here that very few people participate in these earlier stages of open science, and a lot are unsure about whether or not they participate. So we do have a lot of work to do, again, not only in reducing the barriers to open science, but also in creating awareness of open science at all of these stages, not just at the publication stage. And even within publishing, a lot of the researchers we talked to, they focused on like author pays, basically gold open access, and had less awareness of other types of open publishing. So I just want to applaud you all for being here as young scientists learning about open science and thinking about open science, because we need that. So thanks for being here and participating.
Great, thank you, Natasha. Great to hear about the work that you all have done, and make sure to check out the publication as well. So finally, we'll have Aoife O'Mahony to tell us a little bit about the UN Major Group, who's again a co-sponsor on the issue. She is an open science focal point with the Major Group and the Youth Science Policy Interface Platform. She has previously served as the publications and communications focal point for the platform, and is currently completing her PhD in psychology at Cardiff University in the UK, where she focuses on open science initiatives within academic journals that aim to promote rigor and transparency of scientific research across disciplines.
Thanks, Adriana. Hi, everyone. As Adriana has said, my name is Aoife, and I'm Open Science Focal Point with the Science Policy Interface Platform at the Major Group for Children and Youth. And I also am in the final stages of a PhD working on open science in scientific publishing, especially around kind of initiatives and formats within journals that can increase the rigor and transparency of published scientific research. But today I'm here representing the Major Group for Children and Youth, which is a UN general mandated space for young people to meaningfully engage with different UN processes. Within the Major Group, I'm specifically here on behalf of the Youth Science Policy Interface Platform, which kind of runs across the MGCY group, and it's focused on engaging young people in UN processes that involve science, technology, and innovation specifically. So our work falls under various different thematic clusters, which are pictured in the slide, including open science, the technology facilitation mechanism, data, and capacity building, among other topics. As a group, we're in the process of formulating our work plan for the year, but so far we've been working with the UN Statistics Division to plan a youth hackathon, which we actually ran last year as well. Went really, really well. We're also creating training and programming to teach young scientists and engineers how to engage with the UN system. And we're attending various different UN fora, including the Science, Technology, and Innovation Forum, where we'll be contributing inputs and interventions and plan different side events. So on behalf of the platform, we are extremely happy to be partnering with JSPG and UNESCO and Global Young Academy on this special issue. And we just want to thank you all for coming to this workshop today. And feel free to sign up to our mailing list at our website, or follow us on Twitter if you're interested in learning more about the platform or possibly joining us in the future. Thanks, everyone.
Great, thank you, Aoife. Thank you so much. So make sure to check out MGCY and all their initiatives as well. So thanks again to all of our partners on the issue. So we're gonna switch now to our main speaker for today. So I'd like to introduce Vincent Larivière, who is a Canada Research Chair in the Transformations of Scholarly Communication at the University of Montreal, where he aims to increase understanding of how knowledge is currently being disseminated by analyzing characteristics of papers written by academic researchers. His research will improve understanding of how knowledge is produced and distributed, and will provide insight for developing public policies on scientific and technological research. And we'll share a link to his longer bio in the chat. That's just a snippet of his background. And thank you so much for joining us today, Vincent.
Great. Thanks so much for the invitation. So for the next 20 minutes, I'll try to just give an overview of what I believe makes a good policy paper. And I started that exercise as kind of a, let's say, theoretically, what makes a good policy paper and from experience. But then some of you who know me a bit, and I don't think anyone knows me actually here, but anyway, I like data. So I decided to go and look at the data on what, and that's going to be the second part of the talk. I went and looked at the data on what are the characteristics of papers that actually make it into policy. So trying to take the question kind of empirically. So we'll have some kind of original data that I crunched actually over the last couple of days on that. Then I'll give one example of a policy relevant OA piece that I've contributed to, and then I'll conclude on how to disseminate research ethically. So as you probably know, the amount of scholarly paper that is published is actually totally crazy. So before the pandemic, we had hit 5 million papers, that's in 2019. And in a totally crazy manner, the pandemic actually increased the overall output even more. So in a situation where in some contexts it was even more difficult to do research, the number of papers that we managed to publish in 2020 and 2021 actually does not even fit in an Excel chart. So that gives you an idea. I had to put it outside. That is, of course, a joke. So basically, out of these 6.5 million papers, you need to find a way so that your papers actually, if they have some policy relevance, that they actually make it into those policies. So there is indeed genuinely a challenge here. And just to give you a bit of a number, so out of these, so if you take all of the papers that were published since 1900, there's probably 150 million papers that were published. Now, in terms of the papers that were actually cited by policy documents, we're at about 250,000. So that gives you an idea of the subset of those scholarly papers that actually make it into science policy. So, how not to write a good policy paper? So we'll start with the not. So of course, these general criteria could be applied to many research papers in general, not only those that are policy relevant, but of course, as we'll see in some of the data, a good policy paper actually starts by being a good scientific paper. So first point, drawing implications that are not based on the data, that kind of makes sense. There's cases of policy papers that you may have read where the conclusions are already there before there's even a data point. So of course, that's something not to do. Misinterpreting data to draw unwarranted conclusions. So of course, that's a problem for scientific papers in general. Third point here is generic recommendations. So basically providing recommendations that could be applied to any problem. So recommendations have to be relatively specific. Fourth, let's say major flaw, having conclusions here and there rather than in a proper section at the end of the paper. So really, again, keeping in mind that policymakers have a limited amount of time and that, of course, papers have to be properly structured. And of course, drawing vague conclusions that, again, which is a bit similar to the third point, that are a bit general. Now, putting those aside, we can also have more general issues on policy relevant papers. Of course, if there's too much advocacy, a piece loses a bit of, let's say, credibility. Same for any partisanship. Cherry picking data is a kind of a bad idea. The general idea that correlation is not causation also is an issue. And then obscure writing and faulty reasoning. Now, what are the good aspects? How can you write a good policy paper? Of course, the research problem has to be clear. It needs to start with a good research question. Need also to highlight that there's kind of a social importance and urgency to that question. That being said, you need to remain objective, and of course, any overstatement is something that can be an issue. The data needs to be analyzed thoroughly. There needs not to be any hole in there, and data ideally should be replicable and openly available. So of course, I'll go back to many elements related to open science, but of course, right now, open data remains a big issue. Open access rates remain, in the recent papers, the majority are in open access. In terms of open data, it's still a tiny proportion of research papers that are actually openly available. Findings and recommendations should be summarized. So there should be a clear place in the paper where those things actually appear in an independent place where basically it's quite clear what is being recommended, what has been found and what is being recommended. And then if there's any data point, and of course there should be data in most of those papers, there should be some criteria about how to evaluate this data, how to make sure that the data is actually appropriate to answer the research question. The first point here, I think, is a crucial one, because any policy maker who will try to implement what you are being proposed will have counter arguments from maybe people in their organizations or colleagues. So counter arguments, caveats, and all of the limitations of the papers should be present. So again, you need to be transparent on those elements to actually prepare the decision maker to be ready to address those. Of course, suggesting next step and various implementations that can be done. And again, as I said earlier, having a clear conclusion about what should be done and answering the who care question. Why is that important? Why is that something that should be done? So to conclude, let's say this first theoretical part, I made borrowed from a colleague here in Canada, a paper content checklist, which you should probably go through once you have a first draft of your piece. So is the purpose of the paper clear? Do we have a clear research question, a clear reason why this paper is being written? Is the language simple, economical, and clear? In that context, are there actually elements that are unnecessary for the argument? Is the paper easy to read and to understand? Is there a good logical flow to the paper? And bottom line, is the paper inviting to the reader? So again, out of these 6.5 million papers that were written, why should we read your paper instead of another? So now that we have those general considerations, what does the data say? So what I did here is that I took all of the scholarly papers from the Web of Science, which is an international database of the metadata of scholarly papers. And I linked that with a relatively recent data source, which is called altmetric.com. So altmetric.com mines the web for basically tweets associated with scholarly paper, Facebook links, etc. But it also mines policy documents from many governments and agencies, and national ones, international ones throughout the world. So we're actually able to see what is the science that is being used by those policy documents. What is the science that actually makes it into policy? And actually, that's a relatively, I tried to look in the literature, and that's relatively novel. And you guys are the first one to see the data, in addition to me a couple of minutes ago, to be totally transparent. So this is really, really new finding on the characteristics of papers that actually make it into policy. So the comparison is going to be mostly based looking at papers that made it and papers that did not make it into policy documents. So first, really interesting result, it takes time to make it into policy. So what you have on this graph here is the proportion of papers as a function of the publication year that were actually cited in policy documents. So of course, older papers are much more likely to make it, and recent papers have not made it yet. So there really is a much longer lag than what we see in science. So basically, papers papers are actually cited very quickly in new scientific papers. So these numbers for papers would be around 80%, 2 or 3 years after publication. So it goes actually really fast in science. In the case of policy document, there really is a longer time period. And again, it shows that it's actually a tiny proportion of papers. Again, the max here is 2.5% roughly that make it into policy documents. So you need to be patient. Second interesting finding, there's of course important disciplinary differences in the likelihood that papers will make it into policy. So public health and social sciences are actually the two highest, and math, physics, chemistry are actually really low on that spectrum. And quite interestingly, again, public health is not surprising, but social sciences may be surprising to many. Social sciences are seen by some as being some kind of relatively theoretical, not necessarily applied, etc. But actually, in reality, it is among the highest fields in which that policymakers are actually drawing upon. So it shows again on the, let's say, social usefulness of those disciplines. Now drilling down a bit more into the specialties. So we looked at discipline, now looking at specialties that actually have higher proportion of papers that make it into policy documents. So disciplines, of course, related to biomedical aspects of social sciences, environmental and occupational health, social work, health policy, economics, and criminology, again, with social work that actually drive the social science trend higher. And you actually see the heterogeneity of these disciplines. You have criminology and then tropical medicine, which of course lead to different type of policies, speak to different type of policy organization, but have similar rates. So again, not all fields can lead to have the same likelihood that their work is going to be applied into various policies. Now the open access availability, and of course I need to be coherent in our analysis. So basically, there is a slightly higher proportion of documents in open access that are actually cited in policy documents. But that difference is not huge. So of course, when I was crunching the data, we always have our preconceived idea about how the result would probably look like. So I was expecting a much bigger difference between the two. There is a difference in almost all fields, but it's a relatively small one, which means that yeah, open access documents, so availability is important. Open access documents do make it more often into policy documents, but not by a huge margin. It is really a small proportion, which suggests that policy organizations in many cases probably manage to get access to literature behind paywall. I tried to test if there were differences by nation, so that, let's say, nations that have less means would have higher rates of open access policy documents cited in literature cited in policy documents, but there was not really a strong signal here. So again, you live with data, you perish with data. That's the data that we have on that aspect. Now, a couple of interesting findings on the type of research again. So team-based research leads to higher policy relevance, and this is observed again in pretty much all fields. Of course, physics has huge team lists, so it kind of skews the axis here. But again, in almost all fields, size of teams are actually bigger for policy development. And another interesting result here, which is a bit contrary to what I was reading in the theoretical literature on the length of documents. And so there was a sizable amount of literature that actually said that you need to keep your papers short so that policymakers actually read them. That's not what the data shows. So basically, policy cited documents in almost all fields are going to be slightly longer than papers, than basically science, than the rest of the paper. So again, that make the argument makes sense that we should keep it shorter. But again, keeping in mind that good science is actually the science that makes it into policies, and I'll show a bit of results on that in a couple of seconds. It does seem that policymaker can read, even if it's a bit longer. Again, keep in mind that many policymakers have PhDs. They may have had a research career also, so they are able to read these documents. And last data point here on the scientific quality of the documents that make it into policy documents. So what you have here are the field normalized citation rates. So these are rebased citation rates, where basically the world average is 1. So it means that documents that are cited in policy articles that are cited in policy documents are between 3 and 5.5 times more cited also generally. So the science that actually makes it into policy is the elite of the science. It's the best of the science. So you need to be, in a way, first scientifically relevant in order to be also policy relevant. So that's what these data suggest, which kind of makes sense, but also suggests a different path than maybe the one that we would think. We would think that our piece gets published and then policymakers would use it directly. Actually, it may be a piece that is published and it's going to be also cited by colleagues, and then its visibility will also lead to policymakers looking into it and then using it in their documents. So and that's a bit, so I'm sorry for the typo here. It's based and not based. In the altmetric data, we also have the country of the citing policy document. So I tried to see whether we would see any relationship with some countries using some literature more than others. Basically, the 2 domains that are used by pretty much everyone are clinical medicine and also social sciences. But of course, there are some countries that are using it less. So again, Switzerland is much more present in clinical medicine, much less in social sciences. Of course, in that case, Switzerland is mostly is there because it's the headquarters of many of these international organizations related to health. So WHO is in Switzerland, and then Germany, Deutschland, again, mostly or almost exclusively drawing upon literature in clinical medicine, not so much in other fields. This is, of course, really exploratory, but it shows that we can study those phenomena using the tools of science to actually improve the interface between science and policymakers, trying to unroll basically what has worked in the past to develop better policies for the interface between science and policy. So it's a bit like it's being reflective on our own dissemination practices and try to improve the way we communicate our findings with policymakers. So, how to properly disseminate a policy paper? So, of course, I see kind of 2 options. So, of course, targeting a journal like the one that Adriana manages that has a strong policy angle, or journals that have a wide readership across all disciplines, where basically you are sure that the paper is going to be read by a broad array. Of course, targeting a journal is one thing. The difficult part is, of course, publishing in that journal. So everyone can submit to any journal, but the success rate varies, of course, as a function of the journal where the piece is being submitted. Everyone would like to publish in Science and Nature because indeed that leads to broad readership, but the acceptance rates are what they are at basically less than 5%. I would also strongly push towards open review. And by open review, I mean opening the content of the reviews. I think anonymity is something that anyone may want to preserve, but the content of the review, I see no reason why the reviews of papers that are published should not be available. Now, the pandemic has shown that social media can actually be quite useful in broadening the visibility of findings. And I would really urge you to consider circulating the paper on social media and writing a little Twitter thread, which I find personally really, really useful. Many of my colleagues are doing that. I start to do that. So you publish your piece and then you publish a little summary in, let's say, half a dozen tweets or a dozen tweets that basically describe the content of the finding. And again, consider writing a shorter version of the paper as a blog post or in any format, which indeed may serve as a first, let's say, it could lead to the first visibility of the piece for those who don't have much time. And then if it's actually relevant, they may go and read the entire piece. Of course, open access, despite the small difference that we've seen, remain crucial for the availability of those papers for national community. But that's not the only thing. Dissemination language is also crucial. And I just want to tell a little story about what has happened in China early in the pandemic. Again, most of the early COVID papers written by Chinese scholars in early 2020 were written in English. And that led to a lot of issues within the Chinese research community because they were not able to understand what was happening in their own country because Chinese researchers decided to disseminate in English. So it's really crucial that there is a national dissemination in the language of those communities, which could be impacted or which are the focus of those studies. And again, more generally, the general public needs also to be able to understand and access the literature on which their national policies may be based. So I'll go quickly on those things because they were already discussed. But so given open access is a crucial thing, but you need to consider the way you're doing it. So I'll go fast on gold open access, but gold open access is when the final version of the paper is actually freely available to everyone. Now you need to consider whether you want to pay or not. There's been a reappropriation of the concept of gold open access by for-profit publishers where it equals author fees, but in reality, the majority of gold open access journals are free for both authors and for readers. So if you go on the directory of open access journals, you're going to find that the majority of journals there don't have any fees for the authors. So again, paying 9,500 euros for an open access paper in Nature may not be the best way to spend collectively our research funds. And the alternative to that is, of course, green open access, or what is also called self-archiving. So you take the final version of your paper and you put it on bioRxiv, medRxiv, arXiv, basically any of these disciplinary archives or institutional repositories, and this is free. And most journals actually allow it. Elsevier, Springer, Wiley, even the for-profit publishers are actually allowing you to do that. Now, I want to give two general arguments before delving, and I'll try to go quick because I know that time flies, on why open access is crucial collectively and individually. Developing countries oversight open access literature. So again, if you want to have an impact globally, if you want your policy piece to be read globally, they need to be in open access. But also, personally, open access papers are more cited because they're more available. So it's basically the flip side of the previous slide. If your paper can be cited by more researchers in more countries, it's going to attract quite likely more citations. So, quick example of a policy relevant paper that we wrote a couple of years ago, and that's on the efficiency of open access mandates. So government over the last basically 20 years across the world have implemented open access mandates. There was no data on what was working. So we decided with my colleague Cassidy Sugimoto to actually look at the characteristics of the mandate that actually worked well. So that was an important policy question. There were policies already implemented, but no one was actually doing any monitoring for those. So we picked up a couple of US funders, a couple of Canadian funders, a couple of British funders, and then the European Research Council. And then looked at, using data, what were the mandates that worked and what were the mandates that did not work. And we saw huge differences within country and across country. So on the top left, you see mandates in the US where basically the NIH is at 90% and the NSF is at 50%. And in the same country, one is working, let's say, relatively well, not perfectly, but at 90-something%, it's working fairly well. And one was actually not working at all. In Canada, it was a catastrophe, where basically for two of the three research councils, 30% of the papers were actually freely available in open access. In the UK, things were actually improving, but it was all based on an APC model. So of course they had open access, but the cost, the collective cost was actually really, really, really important. So basically, once the piece was published, I had it took a week and I had a call from the three Canadian Research Council, which basically asked me what they should be doing. And what we were showing actually in the piece is that it was crucial to have a proper infrastructure for dissemination. So why is the NIH mandate working very well? It's because it has PubMed Central as a dedicated infrastructure. And it also had an infrastructure that allowed for monitoring. So Canada did not monitor anything, was only basing its policy on the goodwill of researchers. We saw it was not working. You needed an infrastructure. You also needed to have no embargo on deposits. So in Canada, for instance, you have 12 months to deposit your paper. In the US, you have to deposit immediately, and then they're going to open it. The archive will open the paper once it's allowed. There was also an important effect of disciplinary culture, where basically some disciplines were not behaving very well, and APCs were an issue again in the case of the United Kingdom. So that piece was, we had two choices again in terms of publication venues. We decided to go with a multidisciplinary journal that actually allowed for the piece to be visible at the world level, and we indeed also made sure that the piece was available in open access. Before concluding, I just want to reemphasize one thing which was mentioned by a couple of the previous speakers on the importance of open access to solve our global challenges. So COVID is a good example of something. I would not say that we solved it. That's not my point, but the scientific community kind of grouped together, and even for-profit publishers, to actually make sure that the papers are freely available. So as of a couple of months ago, we looked at all of the coronaviruses related paper, and what we actually see is that the vast majority were opened by Wiley, Springer, etc. What is actually quite striking and probably a bit more depressing is that they're not doing the same for other issues such as climate change. So we're taking one topic which is urgent, which is COVID, but then the other topic, which is also urgent and even more threatening, we're actually not doing it. And so this is true for climate change, but it's actually also true for all SDGs. So these are the open access rates of all of the SDGs. Some of them are above 60%, but that remains quite low. But there's a couple of them, affordable and clean energy, which are at 40% roughly. So again, there's a lot of work to be done, even on topics that are related to the future of humanity. Our open access rates remain low. So to conclude, how to publish and to evaluate science ethically, we need to stop publishing for prestige. We need to think about publishing for common good. We need to see dissemination as the important thing that we should do as scientists and make sure that our research is available. We need to encourage transparency at every level, from peer review to data. And again, really make sure that anyone who wants to read a paper can understand the context in which it was done. Following on what was said about the UNESCO Open Science Policy, we need to support non-for-profit publisher and non-for-profit collective infrastructure. And that is it. I'm going to stop here, and I thank you for your time.
Great, Vincent. Thank you so much. That was really fascinating research. I'm going to have to go back and look at the data more closely. And I'm glad you mentioned that these ideas related to policymakers. So that's one of the things that I talk about this in the introduction. But JSPG, obviously, we publish scholarly work, and it's very, research and evidence-based. But we do try to reach policymakers with this work. And so it's important, especially for students who are thinking about submitting for this issue, to think about real world relevance and how a policymaker might read what we're doing. And also what you're saying about kind of tweeting and writing short snippets or blog posts, that's very relevant and important. Definitely support that as well. And I wanted to just share one thing that we do have this media page on our website where we highlight authors that have been cited or sort of, highlighted in different areas by the media, by their university or other areas. And again, some of these are kind of those kind of blog kind of formats. So we do try to kind of bridge the gap between the publication and the policy or reaching the person that you're writing to, right? It's always the policy impact question. I think, and then so one question for you, kind of bringing it back to the special issue here. So you talked about kind of the different formats, you know, so a lot of folks that submit to the journal are trainees, you know, students who are in graduate school and writing about different topics. And how, you know, what would you suggest that they think about, again, from your knowledge on open science, when they're writing a topic about open science policy, right? So kind of bringing it back to this call for papers.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I'm going to answer by saying what I think, what should be, what are the topics that people should do research on, okay? Because so we don't know what works and what does not from an open data point of view. Open data is it's not there's a bit of a technical issue, but that's not where most of the issue lies. It's mostly a sociological organizational issue. And we need to understand why for some fields it's worked, why for some other field it doesn't. Try to find a way to create a proper incentive so that researchers in other fields are doing it. And of course, it's a complex issue because it also clashes with a couple of ethical concerns. So when I was trained in the social sciences in the late 1990s, they were telling us to burn our questionnaires and answers after the analysis was done, because the sacrosanct thing, the thing that we had to keep at all costs was anonymity. So no one has to find at any point who answered those surveys. So they had to be destroyed. And so you put that in contrast with open data and ways to make the data available forever. It doesn't align. So again, this is, I believe, a very important issue. Then, of course, from a technical point of view, how we can create these collective infrastructures to end basically the corporate control of scholarly publishing. So we really need to focus on those things and understand, again, what are the ways that we can actually make a shift from these Elsevier journal, that to name one, and to non-for-profit venues. Again, it's in everyone's interest. So those would be the two topics. But again, don't hesitate to send me an email. Those who are unsure about topics. I have more projects in my head than I can finish. I hope it's the case for everyone.
That's great. We really appreciate that. And thanks for being here to give this introduction. I think it's a great segue to our next section. We'll now have you all do some practice on what Vincent talked about and some of the issues that you heard about in the introduction. So I'm just gonna tell you a little bit about the breakout rooms. So the idea is, again, focusing on this call for papers. What we will do is have you essentially craft an outline for your policy paper as a group. This can be on any topic, again, that was discussed today, and just sort of for the purposes of the exercise, going through a series of questions to think about how you might formulate an argument on a specific policy. So they're organized in terms of questions to go through. The moderators will help guide you through the questions, think through a problem, a specific policy decision, and then designing a specific solution. And then we'll come back and talk about that. The four topics here, again, are related to our upcoming webinars. And we'll have our rooms broken down into these areas as well. So you should see the link to the breakout room documents in the chat. And again, all this information will be in the document as well. So we'll take about maybe 45 minutes or so, kind of see how things are going, to give you some time to practice here. And then just to introduce, sorry about that. Not sure why it looks that way. Again, the moderators, you've heard from Aoife already, Natasha and Fereshteh, who are the slide here, and then Irene, who's the third. Again, sorry for the mix-up here. So Irene, who I did introduce, is an associate professor and director of Smart Engineering Systems Research Center at Nile University. Again, she will be moderating one of the rooms as well. And just to remind you, the moderators, if you can please take notes in the documents, the reviewers will then use that to review the notes and go based on that. So, all right. If there are no questions right now, and I'll be in the main room if anything comes up, we can go ahead and go into the breakouts. All right, is everyone back? That's good. All right, well, welcome back. Hope you had some good conversations, so a lot of good notes. So for the next 20 minutes or so, we'll just have our moderators report back a little bit, a few takeaways, kind of making sure that the thought process you went through. And again, this is meant to be kind of collective learning, anything that you think would be helpful for authors that want to submit in what you learned from your room. So I'll just go in order, starting with Aoife.
Yep, thanks, Adriana. So yeah, we were in breakout room 1, and our kind of focus for the room was open science policy development, infrastructure, and capacity building. So we had a few different thoughts on this, and I think the main kind of problems that we that came across were the kind of barriers to science, the need for more openness, the lack of resources for science itself, and also to engage with kind of open science as well. There was some talk about how this related to kind of tenure processes and researcher evaluation as well, the kind of the focus on kind of peer-reviewed publications and open access, which was a broad theme throughout the discussion. So the stakeholders that we thought were involved with these issues were kind of very, very interconnected, lots of different stakeholders, particularly kind of industrial corporate entities, investors, different industries like the agricultural and food industry could be relevant depending on the specific sustainable development goal or topic area. But that a lot of these goals are quite interconnected. There was also talk about the role of journals in acting on these kind of problems, and the importance of funding agencies as well, particularly when it comes to prioritizing kind of public engagement and citizen science and aspects like that. So we had a couple of different policy options that we talked about. There was some discussion about how there's a lot of academic freedom in science, and that a lot of that potentially can lead to a lot of research and kind of resources being spent on research that doesn't necessarily have a lot of societal impact. So that it might be important to somehow kind of try to incentivize research that aligns with the sustainable development goals and kind of prioritizes real societal impact. And that funding agencies might have a role in providing incentives to do research like this. We also talked about the need, very related to that, for citizen involvement in determining kind of research priorities and involvement in the research process, so that there's real kind of engagement from the public. And then on a slightly related note was the need for kind of open access internationally, the need for resources and research information to be accessible, especially to researchers in low and middle income countries, and that a lot of the onus there is on high income countries to really make sure that that's all accessible, not just research findings, but more detail on like specific methods, data availability, that's all really important in terms of increasing access as well. So a lot of it boiled down to kind of, we got cut off because we didn't quite finish in time, but a lot of it boiled down to kind of open access and prioritizing research, research that has a societal impact. That's kind of as far as we got, but yeah.
Sounds good. Well, it sounds like a lot of good ideas and related to some of what Vincent talked about with the funding as well. So, and I like how you pointed out how it relates to the SDGs and depending on which one you're focusing on. So I'm curious to see what people will be doing. That's a good thing to keep in mind as you're writing your paper on this. So thank you. Okay, Natasha.
Hi, thank you. We had a lot of great discussion and of course a lot of overlap on these ideas too of things like incentives came up a lot in our discussion. So again, this idea that all of these topics are kind of interconnected. We kind of talked about several different ideas and then voted. A reminder, if you were in this group and you haven't voted on the final policy option you want to focus on, please do that. And the two ones that we kind of landed on were so we talked a lot about language and accessibility, and not just language, you know, we speak different languages, but also making, you know, speaking the language of lay people and making the science accessible to the public, both in words, but also in visualizations and the way we visualize our data. And, you know, people talked about animations about the scientific research. And there were two things that we came up with around, and also education for science communication, but also being able to think critically and interpret science. So the two things we kind of focused in on from that were having journal requirements for lay abstracts, animations, or video abstracts, or abstracts in local languages when research is conducted in a different country. And someone in the group mentioned that journals sometimes do charge for these types of things. So removing that and maybe actually requiring these things, particularly if research is funded by, you know, public funds, basically by a governmental organization or something. And then the one we spent the most time focusing on, which was, I think, one that maybe has been talked about less, is just kind of legitimatizing, I have trouble with that word, legitimatizing science communication as a career and as an expertise. So I think a lot of times it is important for scientists to be able to communicate their research, but there is a special expertise that comes along with science communication and illustration. And we talked about some possible ways of, you know, really validating that career and giving more power to science communicators. So we talked about incorporating science communication in undergraduate and graduate programs, journals and funders requiring collaboration with science communicators and illustrators as part of their funding. We talked about Frontiers for Young Minds as a good example of a case where this is done. So that's where kids are asked to rewrite scientific articles in their own words by working with scientists. We talked about rewards and incentives. So the fact that as scientists, we're often, you know, valued based on how much we publish and on how we share that research. And I know things like Altmetric are trying to get around that. And then also as a different stakeholder, potentially associations mandating science communication, particularly in the medical field. So again, yeah, we really focused in on this idea of science communication and illustration, and that as an expertise and a legitimate and necessary career.
All right, thank you for that. Yeah, I really like this focus on training and how we should, you know, teach more science communication. And your point about the lay audiences, like we said, that's something we will be talking about in one of the webinars. So something to keep in mind. All these topics will come up, so feel free to sign up for that. But that's a really important area to think about. Thank you. Okay, Irene, are you here? Can you hear us? There you go.
So our session was room 3. It was topic incentive, rewards, and evaluation methods for open science acting. We had so our title was democratizing science and making open science more accessible to researchers and allowing navigation of the data landscape. So we were kind of talking about mitigation and navigation and how to have this idea easier to people to deposit their data. And we also talked about the difference between open science and fake journals, and how open science could not be not costly and how we could convince journals to have free access. So the main problem was incentives for scientists are not aligned with the open science. And there was another very important question to raise is how many academics or scholars are aware of that even, and they ask about it and they want to know about it. So this problem led us to thinking about how to classify the data, and even if the data is free, you need to go to the university. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you were breaking up for a second, but yeah, try again.
Okay. And how can I was talking about how to classify data into subjects, since there is a huge argument about open science, and also the researchers feel very overloaded with how to collect data, write properly, publish and pay. So it's a lot of issues. So basically, when we're answering the questions that were under the problem statement, we found out that there was no good place to put data across disciplines. Also, open science was maybe accessible for researchers, so that more researchers would do open science and there would not be this gap. Of course, I mean, it was very important that we stop. It was also very important that we need to discover kind of, people are expecting that high impact factor publication means high index and good peer review and good quality. So the relation between high impact and good quality should not be that specific. Also, the stakeholders included many stakeholders: funding agencies, universities, governments, journals, scholars, institutions, librarians, and we had a librarian in our breakout room, so she was very helpful and she gave us a lot of insights about that. Of course, open science initiatives too. So we looked at why APCs are unaffordable, the relation between the promotion in universities and the publications. And people your faculty, obviously, if you're a PhD student, they are expecting that you have a lot of publications and stuff like that. So we had a policy that we suggested is standardize the data collection methods in each discipline and create kind of easy navigation to find each discipline. Of course, we suggested in this policy we could remove the cost of publication or decrease the cost. I mean, if you really understand why this journal has a high cost related to the peer reviewing or whatever, you could maybe they could convince us. This policy could have another recommendation, which is the thing about the preprint. So we suggest using the policy that we just mentioned and going along with the preprint with maybe demographic classification. So we thought if we choose this solution, people would trust that the paper is of a high quality and peer reviewed, and we could explain now to people that having open science is trustworthy, even if it's less cost. And this policy would help us to differentiate between the real and fake journals, which was one of our important concerns at the beginning. And of course, this would let people publish more, scholars, of course, publish more articles, pay attention more to analyze the data and make sure that they have correct data. Thank you, and sorry for taking so long.
No, that was very helpful. A lot of, again, good topics. I'm still digesting some of this. But just to mention what I said before, so this question of incentives and how to publish is important. But again, what I said before is that in terms of JSPG, we are peer reviewed and we don't charge authors to publish here. So credibility, and we have the obviously credibility for the past 10 years. But again, if you're a student, you want to publish, it's a good place for you, as we're not charging anything for open access. So, okay. Last but not least, Fereshteh in room 4.
So our room was on fostering international cooperation and reducing gaps in access to scientific knowledge through open science. And almost like all the other rooms, the main topic was open access publishing. So the problem that we identified was lack of visibility for researchers in developing countries because of high costs of publishing and open access publishing. For example, in some countries, when a country is moving slightly from a low income to middle low income country, then they have to suddenly pay a lot more for publishing, and this is not gradual, and the pressure would be on the scientists and the researchers. So this was the main problem, but also lack of awareness about possibilities for practicing open access and open science, and language barriers were adding to that. So for the second question, identifying the stakeholders who could act on this: international research funders, national funders, national authorities, publishers, especially those who don't practice open access, to join them, the movement, and national academies, universities, and yeah, these are the people who should get involved. On the other hand, we also discussed who would benefit from that, and basically the scientists of developing countries whose work is less visible or marginalized researchers would benefit if the problem is solved. And so we actually discussed several potential policy options, but very broadly and generally. To put them together, I think I can summarize that to enable international collaboration through open science, first we need to make sure that this is possible at the national level. So national authorities, academies, and universities should invest on enabling the researchers to publish in open access to ultimately give visibility to their work, improve the quality of their work, and enable them to join international collaboration. So maybe we inverse the problem. And they can do this by raising awareness about possibilities, engaging different stakeholders, as I said, including publishers. And one suggestion was that national authorities and funders can promote open access journals, like national journals that are funded by national money, and then promote or even make obligatory for researchers who do their research with national funds to for sure publish in these journals or repositories. They can be open repositories. So if a researcher is publishing their work in an international journal, they should be obliged to also publish it in this national open access repositories. And yeah, I think that's it. And we could not continue further to choose one of the solutions.
Thank you. I'm really glad you brought this up. The question of different countries and access to science, which I'm sure, again, we'll discuss in the webinars. And again, very interesting topics in your room as well. Other thing you said with the language barrier. So I just want to point out this, one of our previous publications that we translated into a number of languages. So that is an option if you'd like to do that. We do publish in English, obviously, but we do translate them as well. That might help also for this increasing more international participation. So thank you. Okay, so, and I think what you were saying about that is, it's not enough time to get through all the thoughts that people have. It's really just meant to give a little, taste of what it's like to think about these issues, and that's why we have a second day. So just quickly, tomorrow we'll have more in-depth discussions of these issues. So let me just share this again because we're close to the end here. So one thing, just to remind you again, the call for papers, the deadline is July, and we'll have our webinars coming up to discuss all these topics really in depth with some experts as well. And then tomorrow, just gonna go through the reviewers also. So we will continue these conversations more in depth. Again, this was just a little bit of taste. We'll delve a little more deeply into these ideas, have folks again who volunteer to review the answers and discuss with you more. In addition to Natasha, who's here today, we have Grace of Northwestern, who's a PhD candidate at Northwestern, Denise from Virginia Commonwealth University, and NCF from the Institute of Advanced Studies in Basic Science in Iran. So looking forward to the second day and everybody's participation. And again, thanks for joining us today and looking forward to your submissions to the issue. Yeah, so hello, everyone. Welcome to our day 2 of our Open Science Policy Writing Workshop, organized by the Journal of Science Policy and Governance in collaboration with our issue sponsors, UNESCO and the UN Major Group for Children and Youth, and outreach partner, the Global Young Academy Open Science Working Group. And again, I want to remind you of our call for papers on open science. Again, some of you weren't here yesterday, so you can see more details here on the background as well. So today we'll continue conversations in breakout rooms that we started on the topics we discussed yesterday, which are around the UNESCO recommendation on open science. And you'll get a chance to see, to talk to some of the reviewers today who looked over the materials. Again, I'm going to share the breakout room document and the rubric where they've made comments, so you can see that and discuss that today. So since we'll be working in groups, I usually do introductions, but I'm also working in the background in the breakout room. So, and also if you all have some introductions you'd like to do, we just briefly touch upon who would be here today. What I wanted to do is go through and have everybody tell us a little bit of background about yourself, your interest in open science, and something from the review that you thought would be useful. Again, facilitate a little bit of group discussion here, and then I'll be setting up the rooms in the meantime. So let's see, can we start with Grace?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Grace. I'm a PhD candidate at Northwestern University in Material Science and Engineering, and my work is specifically, our cats don't like each other. Please stop. Okay, so the cats are gonna fight. I'm gonna ignore that. But we're specifically working on medical devices that dissolve in the body, so I design materials for those applications. And I think my interest in open science comes really from a lot of medical access and inequities, and the idea of, you know, what a lot of under-researched medical issues. And there's like huge data gaps, at least in the United States context, between, you know, women and men on various health conditions. And then there's also racial data gaps and biases that erupt. And so how do we fix those without, you know, participation of those groups? And so this is definitely like a big topic I really care a lot about, and so brought me to like this topic specifically. And kind of like in my review today, I guess I'm focusing really on like strong causal models. So really, like when you say you're going to implement a policy, how can you prove that that's actually going to translate into the impact you want? So thinking about the connection between policy proposal to end solution, as in like end impact. So that's kind of my focus today as we talk about open science. So.
All right, pass it on to Denise.
Hi, everyone. My name is Denise. I'm a second-year graduate student in the social psychology PhD program at Virginia Commonwealth University, and my current research focuses on examining how mindfulness training influence empathy and pro-social behavior toward social outgroups. So with the replication crisis in psychology, our field is really trying to do better in terms of contributing to reproducible research and engaging in open science practices. So I learned about the Open Science Framework, OSF, when taking a data science class last year, and I also have been using it to directions my research and also keep track of different versions of my projects. And I look forward to hearing more about everyone's thoughts on how to apply open science practices to encourage public participation and inclusion of diverse voices in knowledge production in today's workshop.
Thank you. Any comments from the review process?
I saw that the group came up with a lot of good policy options, especially targeting how we can make the knowledge more accessible. So making it more adapting to the local language. And so I really look forward in today's workshop to see how exactly we're going to implement this policy and what exactly what's the audience that's the target of the policy.
All right. So room 3 was Encia. Let me get the
Hi everyone, do you hear me?
yes. 1 second.
Yeah, the point is it seems I cannot have access to the video because the organizer has stopped that. Anyway, my name is Rafieian, and also I'm the astronomer from Iran. I'm the faculty member of the astronomy and also the executive committee member of the GYA, Global Young Academy, and I'm really happy to be here with you. My interest to the open sciences first is that since I'm early career researchers, of course, I'm struggling with publishing papers in high impact journals and also the qualifications of the faculty members. Of course, it's really annoying since you are started your job recently. And one of the other issues is that since I'm from the developing country, one of the issues is that you always have less access to the data since your countries are not contributed to accessing the data, especially as an astronomer. So I'm really interested to see that how one can really get involved in this topic without really paying for the data, but being able to analyze that, somehow paying the price of the data by analyzing the data for the communities that they have access to such kind of data, especially in the case of the astronomy, that of course, not all of the countries can have such kind of the instruments and telescopes to reach the data. Regarding the draft, yesterday we couldn't get time to go to the solutions to discuss more. Of course, it's one of the challenges that you already have regarding the open sciences, and I hope that today we can at least discuss about it more and to see that which one of these solutions could be more reasonable to consider it in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Natasha?
Hi, everyone. I have a little bit of a cold, so don't mind me. I am an assistant professor at Gettysburg College, so I'm just starting my 3rd year, or just finishing my 3rd year as a professor. I'm a marine scientist. I focus on seabird ecology, and I use a lot of open data in my teaching and in my research. And so I'm really interested in open data. I'm also very interested in open educational resources, which is maybe a facet of open science that people think a little bit less about. So have really made a push to make all of my classes zero cost, just in terms of making them more accessible to all students from all backgrounds. And yeah, in terms of the discussion today, I was able to join yesterday and had a great discussion with my group. And I look forward to, hearing from a new group today. I think one of the things I think is interesting is there are certain topics that come up a lot in all of groups, it seems like. And one of them is the cost of open access publishing, and kind of the north-south divide in terms of those costs. Another one that I see that keeps coming up a lot is, how we're evaluated as scientists, and these ideas of promotion and how science is taken into that. So yeah, I'll be interested also to just kind of see what common themes come out, even though we are focusing around 4 different topics today. Thanks so much for having me.
Great, thank you, Natasha. So that's really all we have by way of introduction. This is kind of your opportunity to learn from the folks who are moderating, talk more about the topics, as has been said several times. I know you all didn't get to all the questions yesterday, so it's really an opportunity to delve more deeply into these topics, talk through questions and policy solutions, how you might implement them, and really think about how you might write a paper on this topic. And we do encourage us, that I can reiterate this again at the end, but if you'd like to work in groups, these workshops have been helpful for facilitating sort of group submissions. If that's something you're interested in, let us know, and we can share emails of the folks in your room if you'd like to work with them to submit the paper. But excited to see how these discussions go. Just to remind the moderators again, so we'll take about 45 minutes or so to discuss the topics, and then we'll ask you again to report back a little bit of takeaways, again, facilitate some learning in groups here. And then we'll wrap up for today. So that's it for now. So I won't take any more time. I'll open the rooms now, and then I'll be here if anyone has questions or any issues. But enjoy. Okay, looks like everyone is back. So we'll go ahead and go through the rooms and report out a little bit, any kind of general takeaways that you have for the group. Let's starting with Grace.
Yep, so I was just typing up my notes. So from yesterday, we had a couple ideas, but I think for our discussion, we centered around this kind of outcome that we want around more open access research information, because our breakout room was specifically focused on capacity building, and part of capacity building, it seems like, needs to be, more mechanistic, more mechanisms for open data sharing. So some of the stuff, high level stuff we talked about was kind of about, thinking about how each country's funding agency plays a key role in, stipulating what open access research and data sharing. And so, one of the people in our group was talking about how the NIH, part of their grant is like a requirement to put data in like a publicly available database. And so what does those stipulations look like across different fields? And then how is there a way to coordinate that kind of on a more global level? So thinking about kind of what comes out of that is maybe more network creation. So thinking about the role of the United Nations and agencies like UNESCO in sort of networking researchers, so there's more open data sharing, more databases that are maybe not just country specific, but globally accessible, and thinking about what's like maybe more incentivization to promote fields that maybe aren't as open access centered, to be engaging in, per journals, open access journals, preprints, data sharing. So that's definitely one big area of conversation around accessible data. We also talked a lot about the language accessibility. So thinking about how most research is published in maybe like English, and then maybe French or Spanish as like these major global languages, or Chinese, and thinking about if there are people who don't speak those languages, or are not, that's not, again, a major language for them, how would they then access research information if most of the journals are published in one language? And so this idea was still kind of nascent, but thinking about how could we coordinate translation of research? Maybe is there ways that we can be using some of these more evolving, translation algorithms? I don't know how effective they would be, but thinking about that as like a way for research, if it is open access, how is it also available in different languages for different people? And then I think some of those other ideas that are more like less of a focus, but still important, is like more education and training opportunities for early career researchers to be able to navigate open data, open hardware, other these kind of open access models. And especially for like some people, it's really difficult to know how to use them if you've never used these tools. And so kind of maybe trying to put more of them in one place so that information is accessible, especially if it might just be in a lot of like, you learn from your peers, but maybe you don't like if you wouldn't learn if you didn't have like a peer to teach you. And just, I think the final piece is just around like corporations, especially these global nationals that do a lot of data collection and scraping. Is there more encouragement for them to be open access about their data? That was definitely like more of a nascent idea. So yeah, I think there's a lot of seeds here, and I think with some additional work and time, maybe could get more like, you know, quantitative, like accessible policies out of them. But I think there's some good seeds here from our discussion.
Very good, thank you. A lot of good ideas. And as we mentioned yesterday, we'll be discussing all these topics in our upcoming webinars, which I'll share again at the end. But I wanted to point out for those who weren't here yesterday that we did have one of our publications translated in a number of languages last year. So this will likely happen with this issue on open science. Is obviously we're calling for more of this to happen, and we can also translate from English. So just TBD, or something that you might want to look at. Great. All right. So moving on to room 2, Denise.
Yeah, so I think language is also another common thing that our group discussed, because the general public do not have the science background to understand the research finding, but also language can also present a barrier for communities where their local language is not English, and to understand these scientific findings. So we propose like 2 policies. The first one is that there should be general requirements for abstract and the research finding to be published in local language. So our members talk about how there should be like services that researchers can reach out if they want to translate their research into like the local language. So the barriers are not just on the researchers, and there could be like an open platform for this kind of translation service. There's also the second policy is supporting and validate scientific communicators and illustrators as validate like career options, because what we've seen during COVID-19 is like the general public cannot understand a lot of these like newest like findings regarding like the transmission of disease and the virus. We need to train science communicators who can translate findings for the lay people to easily digest. So one reason is that science papers can be full of like jargons. So it is important for us to find like common language, but with not like reducing it to like very simple terms, but also not like changing like the scientist findings. There should also be like a requirement for science communications for like, for example, NSF and NIH funded grants. So that's included as part of like the funding. So people can like student, especially like graduate student or early career scientists can get trained. And for countries that have multiple language, for example, like for Canada has like English and French, we need to think about how to provide findings in the findings in multiple languages. And the institution need to acknowledge that there's different forms of communication, such as like using blog posts to reach the general public, and to actually keep like policymakers up to date with the latest findings, because they might not be willing to like read like long research articles. So for our policy, we identify the stakeholder as like, for example, like Ministry of Education and Technology and relevant like science agencies and also universities. And the audience were identified as like the general public.
Very good, thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. Both of you mentioned the training question, and I'm sure this will come up in the discussions, but also how universities can support more of this kind of training and discussion with different audiences, including the lay public. So very good points. Okay, let's go to Encia.
Yeah, in our room, all of the people are from the South. So one of the discussions that we talked about was about the less access to the scientific data, and also for the publications in the South, which is one of the problems. And also we mentioned that that's why maybe not having access to the open science caused this gap between the North and South collaboration, which is one of the main issues. So if we can have open access to the data and also for the science, maybe that helps also for more collaboration, because in these regions, most of the universities, they ask to publish in high impact journals that they have a publication fee, and then since because of the economical issues in South, they don't support their scholars to publish in these papers. That's one of the reasons also scientists in South, they prefer to immigrate, not to stay there, because they cannot get the quality of the publications that they want to get, and also for really going to the higher ranks in the, let's say in their career is not possible for them, because they cannot access the credits that they really want to improve their scientific issues. That's one of the problems that we discuss about that. Regarding the having the access to the data, we know that these days most of the journals, they always ask that are they going to have the open access to your data in your paper, and most of the scientists, they always say yes. But having access to the data doesn't mean that you have an access to the good data. So that data could be completely messy. So you really need to have a really good classification, and also, let's say, standardize how to classify the data, which is one of the main issues. So because no one really check the journals, they don't check your data, how they classify. But you always say that, okay, since that's one of the policies of the journals to have an open access to your data. So you say yes, but at the end, no one can analyze your data again. So it's not really having access to the data doesn't mean that you have access to the good data. So that's one of the issues that someone should be responsible for that. And then even in the case of the journals for the publications, one of the issues that we talked about was that is open science going to help to reduce the gender gap in science? Because at least we know that in STEAM, women are really underrepresented. Is having access to the open science help to the female scientists to be able to publish in a really good journals? Of course, that helps, because females, they don't have that much grant, and they are not in the high quality issues. So of course, having access to the open science will help to reduce gender gap in the case of the science. One of the main issues and questions that of course we couldn't find an answer for, that maybe it's good to raise also here, was that if you really want the journals to reduce the publication fee, even to remove the publication fees, who is responsible to ask these questions? Our universities are responsible for that, because of course the individuals cannot raise this issue. They're saying, okay, why I should pay for the publications that you don't even pay for referees? But who is responsible for asking these questions? And we also mentioned the UNESCO report, since that's one of the having access to the open science is one of the issues that UNESCO also mentioned. Maybe UNESCO helps, but we don't really know that who is responsible to really asking these questions. Maybe universities or some organizations, they should really start this challenge that we really wants to have an access to the open issue. And also one of the issues we pay attention to that is that even when the scientists are really forced to publish, and also they have also budget to pay for the publication fee, to pay the publication fee doesn't mean that their paper is going to be reviewed in a really good way. So sometimes you pay, and even you pay more to get your review sooner and faster, because you are under pressure of the publishing results, and also maybe under the pressure of somebody else and some other groups are going to publish sooner than you. So you pay more, but at the end, whatever you receive by reviewing your paper is not the one that you really want, because you really see that the reviewers didn't pay that much attention to your paper. So paying for the publication doesn't mean that you are going to have access. Your paper is going to be seen in a really better way. So these were the most of the things that we really talked about, these group questions that we try to find a solution. As I said, we prefer to see that how we can have access to the data, how we can classify the data, who is responsible to ask the questions of the open access. And of course, open access can help to reduce the gender gap, and also increase, let's say in this sense, increase the collaboration of the South and North. Thanks.
Very good, thank you. Yeah, I think those are great points that you brought up with the funding and the peer review. those would be great topics for publication. And also we certainly will talk about differences between countries and the gender gap and all of that, sort of the inequities in publishing, very important as well. So very good. Okay, Natasha.
Yeah, so our group had, it was kind of only a couple of the people had been in the room yesterday, and then we had some new people, so we did a little bit of kind of recapping. But we really struggled with coming up with specific policy ideas for some of the topics that had been discussed. And I know someone in the room had said that was an issue they had come up with before. Like, you can have these really good kind of, this thing needs to be done, but then actually coming up with the policy, half of that can be difficult. So the couple of things that this group focused in on was raising awareness. And that was one that we really did. So raising awareness and also incentivizing open access in Global South countries. And that was something that we had trouble kind of coming up with the policy around in terms of a target level of where we're going to actually like force that or like help make that happen. And then the other two things but that came up a lot, and it was something our group was really interested in, and it's clearly, you know, of interest across things. And one thing that came up that was potentially there was just increasing awareness about some of the options for getting APCs waived. So you can contact the journals and stuff like that. We talked a little about how maybe not everyone knows about that, but the two things we talked about in addition to that were having requirements that all papers were published in a local language in a national journal if research was conducted in a country, in addition to being published internationally in English. But there were some concerns that might not work well for countries where there are a lot of different languages being spoken, and that even in those countries, a lot of researchers often go to, you know, English is the language used by a lot of scientists or in science, and that's where a lot of people living in those countries go to look for articles anyway. And then the last one we kind of talked about most, I guess, in terms of a specific policy solution, was this idea that when a country, basically how decisions are made about waivers for APC charges at the country level. So I was doing a little bit of digging around and just looking at some of these. I can, there was this article here about how, you know, some countries, you know, have waivers that are lower income, but not all do. And maybe there's a better way to do this, and to think also not just about like the total economic status of the country, but also how much funding is made available to science. So I think one of these articles mentioned something about like across each country, what percentage of an average scientific grant would it cost to publish an article, open access or something like that. So and we also talked about the fact that a lot of times if a country's income status changes, all of a sudden their APC charges become the full amount of, you know, what it was. It like jumps immediately. So one of the policy things we had talked about was maybe proposing a way that there is a scale as a country changes its income status, in terms of maybe like increasing the APC by, you know, the first year it's 0, and then the next year it's maybe 10% of what it would normally be, or something like that. Some scale that's based on the economic change in the country. But basically just when the economic status of a country changes, this complete shift to full APC charges is just not feasible. And the fact that then within the country, there's still a lot of inequities across institutions and stuff like that in terms of being able to pay. When we weren't sure, I think, you know, I could, if the group was excited to move forward with this idea, I could see kind of researching and looking into proposing different ways that scaling could be done, or what information it could be based on. Again, in terms of just being yes, no, you meet the APC waiver. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Definitely something to write on, and probably there's a lot of policy around that topic. I was just going to point out one thing. So, and again, part of this, you know, this event sort of meant to get people thinking about these things. But if you're looking for ways to develop policies, one suggestion. I'm just going to share one of our issues from last year, because we do have our winning articles that were selected by, so in addition to the publication, but we had a competition in the top 3 that won. So just one example, because JSPG has a lot of good examples of articles you can read that were published, again, which are fairly selective to publish in the first place, but also the ones that are winning articles are really good in terms of the thought process behind kind of these policies. And this is kind of a general issue about different topics in policy that could be a good resource if you're thinking about policy options. Let's see, there's somebody, oh, somebody raised their hand. Let me see if I can unmute you. Siti, can you hear us?
Okay, hi, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so basically in the group earlier, I was in group 2, someone mentioned about, future actions if one is interested to proceed with the topic. Will we actually get, email information of the group members or anybody else from different groups who are interested with the topic to work on it? Yeah, how are we going to do this?
Yeah, that's fine. We can share if your members of your group want to share emails, we can definitely do that from our end.
Maybe on this Google Doc, I mean, I think I could see maybe making a page that says like final ideas and having a few ideas. And if you're interested, you could put your email under them. I don't know if that, since everyone has access to this doc, I don't know if that sounds like a good way forward, but.
Yes, I have a question about the recording. So we'll be posting a recording from both days on our YouTube channel, and then I'll send that out probably tomorrow. So you all can watch that, and the slides will be there as well from the speaker. So should be a good resource. Okay, so we still have a few minutes. I'm just gonna wait and see if anybody else has questions, because it seems like things are coming in now.
Hi, can I ask a question?
Sure, go ahead.
Yes, so I was looking at the submission guidelines for the journal, and I'm having a hard time figuring out what the difference is between like a memo and a policy brief and a policy position paper is. Do you have any resources to direct us to? Because there are examples there, but they all seem similar to me. I'm not used to writing these.
Yes, I can send that out as well. We do have a few writing resources that we usually send. And from the journal, we've also given presentations on this before, kind of what the differences are and different issues that accept different formats. So I can send you that as well. Yeah, I think the other difference is that some of them are obviously op-eds, you're kind of expressing like one side opinion. The memo will be kind of have both sides. So the way the argument is framed is also different, but the format is as well. So yeah, I'll make a note of that to send out some resources. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Dr. Joyce Spraggins. One of the questions I had in our chat room, or I was in room 2, is are emails able to be shared? Like, we had some great feedback from our group, and I expressed interest of, developing a pilot of working together. And so that was one of the questions that came up, is how do we stay in contact with one another and, share email? So I'm just asking.
Yeah, I can send the emails out from your group if people are fine with that. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, any last minute questions? Okay, well, with that, thank you again to all of our partners for the issue, UNESCO, MGCY, and the Global Young Academy Open Science Working Group for supporting us and participating in this event. Continue to promote our call for papers. I'm gonna share again all of our channels. Again, for those of you that weren't here yesterday. Let me just do this. And then all of our calls are online, and hopefully this was helpful. And again, we'll hopefully continue this conversation. If you all want to work together, that's really good to hear. And stay tuned for our webinars that are coming up in April, May, June, and July. And again, the deadline for this issue is in July, so you have time to think through some of this, watch the events, come to the event so you can hear more about these topics that we went over today. And thanks again to everyone who volunteered as well.
Thank you.